Hello, I'm ANEKA from Made to Sew and welcome to my Sewing for Beginners series. Now I wanted to do a really short tutorial that shows you how to use an unpicker and how to take apart seams that you've sewn that are wrong, incorrect or badly stitched. So let's have a look. So I have sewn this seam and for some reason I have done it wrong, so I want to undo it. How do I go about doing that? Well, the easiest tool that you can get is one of these little unpickers, and they often come with your sewing machines. Just make sure that your unpicker is nice and sharp. I do have customers in my classes that are trying really hard to unpick things and the unpickers are blunt. So there is a sharp point on this end here, a little blade inside there, and that's what you need to check isn't blunt if you've had it for years. And then a little ball to protect yourself. Now, if you don't have an unpicker to hand and you desperately need to unpick a seam, you can by all means use a sharp small pair of scissors or even some little snips. However, you will find that using an unpicker is easier. Now, the ease of unpicking is going to depend on the stitch length that you have done. We're imagining that you've just done a straight stitch here, and the length I've used here is 2.5 millimeters, so this is pretty standard. Obviously, the larger the length, the easier it is to unpick. The smaller the length, the more tricky it's going to be. You're always going to want to start with your little back stitches, because if you've done a back stitch, that's going to be a trickier area to unpick simply because you have sewn over yourself. This is where you're going to use the point of the unpicker and you're going to slide this underneath the stitches, making sure that you don't go into the fabric. Sometimes that is easier said than done. Make sure you're just going underneath the stitches and pulling out those threads. And feel free to have a go from both sides if that's easier. Once you've undone the back stitching, you can start to open the seam. Most of the time when I'm unpicking for speed, I will open the seam like this, and I will use the point to grab a couple of stitches and then pull open the seam again. And this is nice and quick way of unpicking because I'm able to sort of get through a couple of stitches, and as I pull it, a few more undo. As I said, the smaller the length of the stitch, the more difficult it will be. As I'm unpicking, I do try and keep on top of pulling these little threads out of the way. And you want to make sure that you do remove them all before you sew your seam again, otherwise they can get caught into the seam. Now there are times, depending on what it is you're making, where you can't actually pull the two layers apart like this, and you really just need to unpick it from the top side like so, perhaps if you're doing some top stitching or something. In that case, what I tend to do is to insert the unpicker under every few stitches. So I probably do every 3 to 4. I'll go underneath and open it up. And then what I will hope is that I can then go in the middle of what I have unpicked and I can remove that section. So I'm sort of unpicking every 5 stitches and then pulling out the remainder. And a little pair of tweezers can be really useful here as well if you're not very good at grabbing it with your fingers. There we go. And you'll see on the other side, the thread will just come away. Now, the one tip that I have is that majority of the time, you're not just going to want to grab the unpicker and push it at the edge here, because by doing that, you're probably going to cut the fabric. There are times when I do that for speed, but I've been doing this a long time and I am quite confident at what I'm cutting. However, I would not recommend for a beginner that you just grab your unpicker, put the blade in the seam and slice it. So I would recommend that you pull it apart and catch the next stitch instead. I will also say that when I'm creating sample garments, generally they're in a larger stitch length, so a stitch length of 4 millimeters or greater. And in those cases, I will actually rip open my stitches, but that's because the garment doesn't matter quite as much. You've got to be cautious with your fabric. You don't want to stretch it out, pull it out of shape. But in calico, I will literally rip my seams just like this. When you get to the back stitches at the end, you're again going to need to use the unpicker to remove those. Now, if you don't have access to an unpicker, you can achieve the same thing with a pair of sharp scissors. You're going to need to be going underneath the stitch with the scissors. It is trickier. Or if you're going into the seam, you're just going to be cutting a few stitches and then pulling it open. So it's doable if you don't have an unpicker to hand and you're desperate to unpick that seam, but I do think the unpicker is easier. When you're done with unpicking the seam, you are going to need to remove all of these threads. Personally, I pick them out, but I have heard people suggest using a lint roller to actually roll over the fabric and to pick up all of the tiny bits of thread. So that's a really good idea if you have one of those at home. Once you've unpicked a seam, it can also be a good idea to actually press the fabric again, just to make sure that you don't end up with a crease where the seam was before. You don't want to sew the seam incorrectly again because of a crease or something that's in your way. Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed the lesson.